Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
All right, my friends, let's get this show on the road. Psychedelics for Healing, between therapy and testimony. Oh, sure. Yeah, if you can, that'd be great. Like any good psychedelics conference, we have to talk about healing at some point, even when it is a humanities-oriented conference. So I hope we're doing something sort of a little creative and interesting, and maybe providing some new ways to think about what healing is, what medicine is, some new frames beyond what you might get at a continuing medical education unit offered by a university hospital or something like this. So we have four lovely speakers here. And let's just get started. I will be slide arranging and moderating simultaneously, so bear with me. Okay. Right. So first we have Alex Gearin. Alex Gearin is, he serves as assistant professor and deputy director of the Medical Ethics and Humanities Institute, Humanities Unit at the School of Clinical Medicine at the University of Hong Kong. Please welcome Alex Gearin.
All right. Thank you, Paul. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session. I'm delighted to be here. So today I'm going to present a work in progress. It's kind of a bunch of ideas mashed together that I'm thinking through. So I really look forward to your input, comments, questions at the end. And the work today, I'll be exploring the phenomenology of being a psychedelic therapist, or what it feels like kind of in the body, in the senses, in your thoughts, in your inner worlds, to be a therapist of psychedelic medicine. Now, I'm not a therapist myself, but I'm an anthropologist who spent several months last year doing ethnographic work in a bunch of clinics, labs, and underground settings in Australia, where I'm from originally. Today, I'll examine what the concept of therapeutic attunement has come to mean in a context where clients intentionally enter an altered state of consciousness by taking a psychedelic, and where therapists sometimes unintentionally enter an altered state during the process through what is sometimes called a contact high, although the therapists that I studied, they wouldn't usually use language like that. It'd be more sensory embodied or spiritual language to talk about these altered states, experiences that they have when they're caring for someone on psilocybin. I'll be exploring different ethical challenges that two distinct models of mind present to psychedelic therapy. And by ethics here, I don't mean formal bioethics principles, but the practical challenge of therapists deciding what it means to act well and appropriately in these different states of mind, these different models of mind, and we'll explore two of them. The paper contributes to the anthropology of psychotherapy, helping us understand metacognitive aspects of how therapists think about thinking, how they think about their inner worlds, their thoughts, but also their feelings, their perceptions during psychedelic therapy. And as I said, including when they enter these altered states, but without taking the substances themselves. So I did the fieldwork last winter in Australia. So that's the kind of middle of the year, down under, 2025, across scientific labs, clinics. We have this new authorized prescribers scheme, which is a historic medical pathway that emerged 2023, a very kind of medicalized space for psychiatrists and psychotherapists to work together. So in the new clinics, the labs, but also in the underground spaces where therapists are employing a psychotherapy kind of modality with dyad partners, supervisory meetings, and psychotherapeutic training that got them ready for this kind of work. So throughout the talk, I'm going to use the term client to talk about the participants who receive the medicine. And while this is appropriate for talking about the authorized prescriber clinics and in the underground treatments, it's less appropriate for the labs, where in fact they're not clients, but they're research subjects taking an experimental drug. But I think for the purpose of this study, we're looking at kind of what it feels like to be a therapist. We're just going to call them all clients today. The images on the screen are drawn from online sources of clinics and labs in Australia. They're not representative of the therapists that I studied. All the names are anonymized today, but I'm just sharing this to give you some context of what a dosing room or a therapy room looks like. Okay. So many of the therapists I studied are clinical psychologists that have diverse backgrounds and trainings in psychotherapy, including IFS, ACT, EPT, for those of you who are therapists in the room, somatic-based therapies, existential psychodynamic approaches, and also drawing inspiration from Indigenous traditions, typically Amerindian cultures, but also Aboriginal Australian influences, such as the training provided by IPAT, the Indigenous Psychedelic Assisted Therapy Organization in Australia. So these, not only is there a real eclecticism among the types of therapists that are doing this work, but each therapist is actually can be informed by lots of different modalities. Despite all these different backgrounds, there are some kind of relatively common features of how a drug dosing session looks in psychedelic therapy. For instance, in the Psilocybin sessions, which is what I'm going to focus on today, typically there's two therapists in the room, and the client is on a cozy, comfortable sofa, wearing headphones and eye shades for about 80% of the time. Usually these sessions run for like 6 to 8 hours. So that is the atmosphere, that's the setting in which the kinds of therapeutic attunement are taking place. And the argument I will pursue in this talk is that psychedelic therapy presents kind of new challenges of what therapeutic attunement means when you compare it with conventional psychotherapy. In conventional psychotherapy, it typically refers to the therapist's capacity to sense and respond to the client's inner state through subtle, effective, relational, and embodied cues, as popularized by psychologist Daniel Stern's work in the 80s on the interactions between caregivers and infants. In psychotherapy, attunement assumes a model of mind that is bounded, yet it's partially available through tracking the client's behavior, including through dialogues and inquiry, the talking cure, but also through the therapist inquiring into their own feelings and thoughts for understanding processes of transference and countertransference, or how the therapist might be shaping the interaction in complex and sometimes unintended ways. The concept of attunement is increasingly appearing in psychedelic therapy research, manuals, and discourse, where it's typically used in this classic sense that you see in conventional psychotherapy. However, I'll explore that how when a patient is on a high dose of psilocybin or another psychedelic, the challenge of therapeutic attunement stretches across shifting states of consciousness, even alternate realities, representing something distinct when compared to conventional psychotherapy without drugs. So let's look at these two models of mind to get a sense of their the feeling, the phenomenology of being a therapist, but also some of the practical ethical challenges that each kind of makes available. So in the first model, which I'll call the bounded and private mind, there's a shared challenge for psychedelic therapists involves not knowing what a patient is experiencing, therefore not feeling sure how to help them. Remember, 80% of the time they've got eye shades on and they're on the sofa, kind of having an internal experience, more or less. When describing the mood or atmosphere of sessions as spontaneous and unpredictable, one therapist, she used a metaphor. She said, it's like weather, like a storm of distress or grief or anger or confusion that comes in the room and tends to dissipate after a while, or like a glorious sunrise that can uplift the client for a while before it dissipates again. Clients often enter states of a really kind of emotional vulnerability. Belinda, a well-versed underground therapist, said, "I often feel like I'm working with babies in the room. These little babies in adult bodies," when she was describing how clients might suddenly cry or laugh, but also alluding to the fact that this is happening without it being clear why they are experiencing this kind of shift in their emotional state. For her, it doesn't necessarily matter whether you know, she said, but the important thing is to remain present, caring, and emotionally available. Therapists also described how people on psilocybin can become highly sensitive to the emotions and behaviors of the therapists, sometimes described as a kind of sixth sense, that psilocybin makes the patients very aware of little behaviors in the therapist. This led some therapists to raise concerns about their dyad partner's behavior, such as when therapists might send work emails when a patient is under eye shades with notification pings sounding, or reading scientific papers, or otherwise not being sufficiently present and emotionally available. At the same time, learning to do less is a skill that therapists repeatedly says needs to be learned. Therapists described having to unlearn reflexive tendencies to talk, to explain, to intervene when a client is in distress or having a deep journey, noting that ordinary talk therapy can kind of pull them out of the process they're going through, they tell me. One therapist, very active in the labs, described learning this the hard way when a client perceived her face and body as transforming into their father. She said, and I'll quote her, "They were actually visually seeing me as them, as the father. But you have no idea this is happening, right? I had no idea. So I just kind of carried on being me, the therapist, and talking, saying things to them. And I said way too much. And they heard completely different words to the ones I was saying anyway, because afterwards we talked about it. And I realized that what would have been better is to have been calmer, maybe silent, and just hold their arm, be more supportive with less words." During the dosing sessions, clients may perceive therapists as themselves, as therapists, as persons, but also as animals, mythic characters, erotic lovers, threatening strangers, bizarre monsters, perpetrators, angels, demons, and more. For the therapist, this radical not knowing creates an epistemological gap that they tend to approach with humility, ideally aiming to offer emotional support and to trust that the experience will be therapeutically meaningful over time. Most therapists described healing as involving a kind of natural and somewhat mysterious process where patients move through a sequence of emotions and states and experiences that may appear chaotic in the moment, but then turn out to have an internal logic or a narrative later on. Intervening too quickly, they suggest, can obstruct that process. Bill, an underground therapist, said, "The hardest thing is to resist rescuing people from having a challenging experience," adding that it took him dozens of sessions before he became more comfortable waiting and resisting the urge to intervene. Like others, he suggested that when therapists do wait, clients often move through difficult emotions on their own. At the same time, therapists described this restraint, this need to not quote unquote rescue them, as emotionally demanding. It could be. They spoke of feelings of guilt and confusion when witnessing clients in distress, especially when it's an extended form over days, and resisting to intervene. Therapists worried about imposing narratives or meaning on experiences as they were happening in less than helpful ways. Mary, a palliative care clinician, described the risk of accidentally shaming patients who might be having existentially meaningful yet confusing experiences of death or dying, noting that speaking with them can often cause more harm than good when they're in a deep journey. So in some of this model of the mind that's bounded and buffered and is full of all these unknowns, where the therapist often doesn't know what the patient's really experiencing. A central ethical terrain that therapists articulated was how to provide care while resisting the reflexes of conventional psychotherapy. Excuse me. In this ethics of constraint, the risk of care itself is heightened by radical unknowing, an epistemological chasm that therapists aim to navigate through nonverbal and embodied forms of presence and support, allowing the process to unfold organically, as I just said. So now let's look at a different model of mind that, to my surprise as an anthropologist, when I started to interview and hang out with therapists, I'm kind of surprised at how often therapists described having altered state experiences in the room. Maybe this is comes as no surprise to people in the room, but to me, I was kind of surprised. So in the first model we just looked at, a key problem or challenge therapists encounter is not knowing what the patient experienced. In the second model, the problem becomes what to do when they feel themselves moving into an altered state, and the kinds of noetic or spiritual modes of knowing and perception that occur therein. Despite being sober, therapists sometimes feel the medicine in their own body as a tingling or vibration sensation. It may be tactile, visual, as well as having more dramatic experiences of mind melting and feeling like they enter a shared field of consciousness. So I haven't quantified. I interviewed around 30 therapists. I haven't quantified how many are having these experiences, but my estimate would be a majority. So let's give it a nice, thick, qualitative example. So Mark, a therapist in the clinics, he gave a description that I think would be familiar to many of the other therapists I spoke with. I'll read parts of his kind of long description he shared. He said, those are really glorious sessions when someone really gets in touch with the beyond, with the divine, those mystical domains. I feel when I drive home on those days that I've had the psychedelic in the session. In the room, I will feel it in my body. I get goosebumps. It's like I'm in the presence of the divine right now. The room looks different. It feels different. It feels like it's transformed into a temple, a church, a sacred space. Everything goes quiet. There's a density of energy and a kind of buzzing energy, tingling feeling in the room. So in this atmosphere where a field-like or porous model of mind emerges, one of the kind of ethical challenges that the therapist described to me could be called a kind of cosmic transference and countertransference, to use psychological framing. So I'm going to share a few key examples that have kind of jumped out at me. And I'll read them out in a descriptive form, but just to give you an overview of them first, I'll share these where therapists, some of they also describe benefits of entering these states of mind in terms of how it improves therapeutic attunement. I'll share some of that. But to talk about how it presents certain challenges they described, that included over-trusting the special insights and knowledge that these states of minds afford, confusing one's own feelings with the feelings of the client or vice versa, being swept up in the experience and losing a sense of therapeutic boundaries or your professional role as a therapist, and finally, taking responsibility for the spiritual experiences of the clients and issues of hubris and stuff. So some therapists described intentionally suppressing feelings of an altered state arising out of a concern that they might become less therapeutic. She said, I think my anxiety keeps me grounded when you feel yourself going into dual awareness. Sometimes you can't help but go into an altered state. You're in this beautiful room, soft lighting, beautiful music, you're focused. There is a systematic narrowing of attention, but you've got to do work. You've got to remember, okay, what are they feeling right now? What music is playing? Write this down or that down. How's the blood pressure? But then it's like, oh my God, this is so emotional and I'm almost overwhelmed. So there's this dance back and forth, but you got to remember to work. It's easy to get swept up in that feeling and forget why you're there, to forget what you're supposed to be doing. One therapist described sessions in which clients appeared to take on the clients appear to take on the personality of another person. Another person with a different accent and voice and posture. One time, surprised and unsure what to do, a therapist perceived this event as a form of spirit possession and attempted to perform an exorcism, embodying the spirit of Christ in his own body, which he later decided was not the best course of action. After discussing the episode with his supervisory group of other therapists, he reinterpreted it through an IFS lens, internal family systems therapy. And the character became a part of the person that had been split off. And he described next time how he would aim to guide the patient to become more curious and exploratory rather than attempting to banish that part of them. So the ethical challenge here concerns what framing is appropriate when the space feels spiritual or more than psychological. One therapist who has conducted dozens of sessions in labs and the authorized prescriber clinics described visual experiences of seeing paisley patterns on the wall. This is quite unique. Only one therapist described actually seeing visual patterns despite not having taken the drug herself. And then even after returning home, continued to notice slight visual patterns while showering. These bodily and sensory experiences are interpreted differently by different therapists. Some perceive them as opening up a heightened sense of attunement with the client, that these states of mind help them get in touch therapeutically with the client. Several of them said it's not only helpful, but necessary to be able to move into these states of mind to be a good psychedelic therapist. And I'll share one quote by a psychiatrist. He said, I'd say that this process, particularly when we're talking about oceanic boundlessness, but just when people are coming into touch with themselves, it has a certain vibration. If you want to work in this space, you've got to actually get into that rhythm. Otherwise, you cannot work in this space. So a decision whether to do something or not do something, whether to say something, all has to come from being within the rhythm or the vibration or whatever you want to call it, the field that the psychedelic process is in. To me, that's what attunement is. You don't have a choice. Otherwise, you might as well be in the kitchen cooking lunch. Just come in, check in with them. Just come in and check on them now and again. Yeah, saying that otherwise you'd be like a pharmacological sitter, for example. Therefore, becoming altered is described as both therapeutically useful, reflecting on this kind of model of mind, but also potentially problematic or challenging for psychedelic therapists, that it could heighten therapeutic attunement, but also risk losing therapeutic discernment, dissolving boundaries or a clear sense of role of the therapist. Finished? Oh, okay. Going over time. So let me just wrap it up here. Maybe there's a few kind of theoretical points, but I might just finish on one. There's been, so I think this kind of phenomenological challenge that therapists face entering an altered state unintentionally, sometimes where they don't want to, is something kind of unique to psychedelic therapy compared to conventional psychotherapy. And I think it speaks kind of tangentially to recent concerns of psychedelic ethical exceptionalism, where Catherine Chung and colleagues argue against treating psychedelic therapy as requiring fundamentally different standards, ethical standards, to other treatments. Now, this insight about contact highs, for want of a better term, does not suggest that different ethical principles should guide psychedelic therapy in a normative sense, but that the conditions under which therapists make ethical judgments and the sense of being therapeutically responsible are enacted differently in dosing sessions to conventional psychotherapy. That this can shift quite dramatically given these two models of mind. On the one hand, a state of radical unknowing, not knowing what the patient's going through, and also in the Porous model, where they find themselves entering an altered state on their own. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. I feel like the bad guy with the time sign. No worries at all. All right. Now we have Eli Elster. Here we are. Eli Elster is a PhD student in the Department of Evolutionary Anthropology at UC Davis, conducting ethnographic fieldwork and archaeometric, new word to me, research in Southern Africa. Please welcome Eli.
Don't worry, I'm not going to make anyone learn what archaeometric means today. It's too scary. All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Eli. Thank you, Paul, for the introduction. I'm going to be telling you today about fieldwork I've carried out over the last 6 months in Lesotho. That's a small country in Southern Africa. I found that demands more explanation than I might have expected. There, I'm collaborating with traditional healers to learn more about their use of several different hallucinogenic plants and fungi, and particularly a species of native psilocybin mushroom that was described in the region 2 years ago. Before talking about the actual fieldwork, though, I want to spend some time motivating why I think this kind of exploratory research is quite important for the future of psychedelic research, not just from an intellectual perspective, but from a moral and legal perspective. So when you listen to a book or read a podcast or watch a documentary or read an academic paper about psychedelics, very often the creator will open with a kind of grand narrative about the use of psychedelics around the world. We've all heard this story before. It consists roughly of 3 claims. First, psychedelic use is widespread around the world. These substances have been an important part of many or perhaps all human cultures. Claim number 2, psychedelic use is ancient. Their use is not only observed all around the world, but is something that has characterized human life for hundreds or thousands of years, depending on who you're talking to. Perhaps they'll say longer. Claim number 3, psychedelics have been reliably used as tools for healing, usually facilitated by shamans. I can't take credit for noticing how ubiquitous this story is. This is something my advisor, Manveer Singh, described in his recent book on shamanism. To pull these claims together, he uses the phrase global archaic psychedelic shamanism, or GAPS. I think it's a pretty apt name. Given how regularly this narrative is trotted out, you'd expect that there's pretty robust evidence for all of its claims, right? We've heard this all over the place. And there is some, mainly among a number of societies in North and South America. For example, this is a shaman from the Shipibo people in Peru. Their use of ayahuasca is certainly ancient and associated with healing and shamans. Many other societies across the Americas also engage with their medicines in similar ways. But what about the rest of the world? How much do we know about psychedelic use in Africa, Asia, Oceania, or the Caribbean? Turns out, not very much. There are a few exceptions to this. Iboga use among the Bwiti is pretty well documented, for example. Same goes for the use of fly-agaric mushrooms in Siberia. But other than these few cases, and a couple others, we know remarkably little about how or even whether psychedelics have been used in societies outside of the Americas. As an indicator of this, we have no estimate even of what percentage of recorded societies have clear cases of psychedelic use. There's no established number, despite all of the conversation about global use. Most of what we think we know outside the Americas is actually quite indirect and speculative. And when it comes to the use of psychoactive fungi in particular, the degree of exaggeration can be pretty striking. So a few examples ranging from maybe most to least speculative. This is an ancient Greek relief of Demeter and Persephone handing each other mushrooms. It's often taken as relatively clear evidence that the Eleusinian mysteries involve the use of psychedelics. I think that theory is maybe plausible, but this is certainly not the kind of evidence that we see, for example, in Mesoamerican groups who have codices that directly record the use of psilocybin. There's also the famous bee shaman painted 9,000 years ago in Algeria. You can see the original on the right, and on the left, the reproduction produced by Kathleen Harrison, wife of Terence McKenna. You might be shocked to hear this, but both McKenna antennas, and many others have taken some liberties with their interpretation of the original painting. And beyond this kind of fuzzy logic, the gaps hypothesis has also motivated total fabrications. This is a quote from a very widely read and I think well-regarded newsletter on modern psychedelic news and anthropology and so on. In this interview, a mycologist is being interviewed about the use of psychoactive fungi in Southern Africa. He claims that hunter-gatherer peoples in Botswana and Namibia reliably used mushrooms for trance. He's never worked in the region. I have no evidence of that. I know people who've worked in these groups for decades, and they have no evidence of that. Nonetheless, this is taken at face value by a well-regarded newsletter simply because it fits so well with this broad framing. Now, I don't necessarily want to convince you that GAPS isn't true. My point is that beyond a fairly small number of societies in the Americas, we just don't know very much about psychedelic use across human societies. Beyond the Americas, actual fieldwork on this subject has been quite limited. So even for the sheer sake of intellectual honesty, we should be serious about what we know or don't know based on the ethnographic record. Much of what we might like to know is, for a variety of reasons, probably lost to time. But that's all the more reason to see what we can learn from the rest of the world before even more of these practices disappear. Through fieldwork, we can try to resolve, pardon the pun, these gaps in the GAPS hypothesis. Uproarious laughter, good, yeah. But this isn't just an intellectual exercise. As we all well know, psychedelics have been and continue to be unjustly extracted from communities that have used them for a very long time. How do we prevent this from happening again? Of course, we can reflect on the history of exploitation and identify principles that can guide our interactions with these communities moving forward. But it's hard to make that useful if we don't know who the communities are. To help people protect their rights to these substances, we need to figure out who it is that we're trying to help. Fieldwork can help us identify communities that would benefit from legal and other barriers against future threats of extraction. And given that there's been so little ethnography on psychedelic use beyond the Americas, it's likely that we're missing many opportunities for important and impactful collaboration. So it's with these motivations in mind that I come to Lesotho, shown here on the map, home of the Basotho people. My fieldwork there was spurred by a paper published in 2024 by my friend Brayton van der Merwe, there on the left, and his colleagues. In that paper, they described two new species of psilocybin mushroom native to Southern Africa. The most common and the one I'll be focusing on is Psilocybin maluti, shown on the right there, named after the Maluti Mountains in Lesotho. So on its own, the description of these new species wasn't a huge deal. There are over 160 species of psilocybin mushroom found around the world. More are found every year. But this paper got a lot of traction, mainly because there is a paragraph in it suggesting that traditional healers are using the psilocybin mushroom for various religious and medicinal purposes. As far as anyone knows, this was the first clear suggestion of potentially pre-colonial psilocybin use anywhere in Africa and arguably anywhere in the entire world, again, beyond the Americas. But this paper didn't say very much. It was really just a few sentences. More in-depth fieldwork was needed to verify if it was more than just a rumor and what the actual nature of the use was, if it was in fact happening. So I decided to travel to Lesotho to begin carrying out that more in-depth fieldwork. Through Brayton, I was introduced to my incredible collaborator in this project, Mimosa Betsy Satati, in the middle there. Betsy is a trained Sotho healer, fluent in 5 languages, now a master's student at the University of Exeter, just an incredible woman. I reached out to see if she was keen to collaborate on this fieldwork together, and she was, very fortunately for me. So across 2 fieldwork sessions, one last summer and then one in this recent winter, we traveled around the Lesotho highlands, talking to as many healers as we could to see what they knew about Psilocybin maluti. So far, we've interviewed 24 healers, as well as a number of other individuals. And the picture coming together here is, I think, quite interesting. Most healers, though not all, were at least familiar with the mushroom, familiar in the sense that they know what it is. About half of them had either used it themselves or are aware of usage by other healers or other people they know. And that usage fell into more or less 4 categories, as I've decided to divide it up. The first and the most salient, for sure, was the use of these mushrooms during the initiation of new healers via a brew called Situtu in the Sotho language. That's the brew there. You can see the mushrooms laid out in front. That's about the amount they include in the mixture. So this mixture is comprised not just of the mushrooms, but of a number of other psychoactive plants as well, stirred together into this frothy mixture. New initiates will then consume the brew multiple times a day, often for weeks as they are training to become healers. And as they phrase it, this helps them to thin the veil between themselves and the ancestral spirits that have called upon them to become healers. Typically, they then receive visions and dreams that provide them guidance, inculcate knowledge of new plants, and help them divine lost objects, among other capabilities that are gained throughout their training. Second, many healers use the mushrooms as medicines for a variety of mental, physical, and other conditions. Often this is for problems that we might map on to something like depression or addiction. One person mentioned epilepsy as well. What's intriguing here is that the doses applied are often quite small and mixed together with other plants. This is, I think, a fairly stark contrast to other methods of psychedelic healing that we tend to have in mind, where some large dose is applied in a one-off or maybe 2 sessions. Typically, this is small doses over many applications, again, over weeks or maybe even months. Third, there is some degree of purely recreational use. This is mainly the case among the teenage boys and young men who shepherd livestock around the highlands. Several of them described peers who would grind up the mushrooms into snuff and then, take them through their nostrils, although no one would admit to doing this themselves, I think. As an aside, there was 2 people pointed us to this other guy, and they were both convinced, like, yeah, that guy snuffs the mushrooms all the time. And then we found the guy, and he's like, I've never heard of this mushroom. I don't know what you're talking about. And finally, the mushrooms are considered to be a very useful protective charm against various forms of curses and dark magic, and particularly against lightning. It's widely believed, not just in Lesotho, but elsewhere, that mushrooms grow where lightning strikes, which is in fact true. So people often assume that mushrooms of any kind will ward off future lightning strikes, since it can't strike twice in the same place. For more of the ethnographic details here, as well as some of the arguments we make for this being a long-standing practice and not a recent product of psychedelic tourism or colonial influence, I'd encourage you to check out a forthcoming preprint that Betsy, myself, and others are publishing. To close, though, I'll just say a bit about what I think the major implications are of this fieldwork. One takeaway is that we've probably underestimated the amount of psychedelic use in Africa and perhaps elsewhere. This is Plants of the Gods, a seminal text on psychoactives published by Albert Hoffman and Richard Schultz. In this book, which is considered a almost biblically important compendium on psychoactive use around the world, they claim that Southern Africa is almost devoid of hallucinogenic psychoactive substances entirely, let alone usage. They seem to be wrong, so it seems like we have quite a bit left to learn. It's also worth noting that the nature of psilocybin use in Lesotho is quite different from how we usually think about the place of psilocybin and psychedelics generally in human cultures. This is Gordon Wasson with Maya mushroom stones. He very famously and quite influentially theorized that psilocybin use around the world has been characterized by a kind of mushroom cult, a sort of central importance given to psilocybin mushrooms in various cultures. This is not the impression you get in Lesotho. The mushroom doesn't even have its own distinct name. It's instead one more tool among a much broader ethnobotanical toolkit. And finally, and I think most importantly, knowing more about psilocybin use in Lesotho leads to some fairly important policy implications. Recently, a number of pharmaceutical companies have set up shop in Lesotho to cultivate psilocybin because it's legal there, unlike in neighboring South Africa. Importantly, it's only legal to grow if you purchase a cultivation license for about $2,000 US. For these companies, that's a meaningless sum. For the local healers, that's astronomical. Nobody can pay that. Without that license, it's pretty risky for them to profit from or publicize their work at all due to the threats of legal consequences. All this, despite the fact that, as we now know, people in this region have potentially been using psilocybin mushrooms for decades, centuries, who knows how long. So my hope is that this provides a good example of the imperative to carry out fieldwork in places that have mostly been left out of the ethnographic record of psychedelics. Again, the imperative here is not just scholarly. Indigenous communities deserve intellectual rights, access, and other protections over their medicines. As people with privileged access to many forms of hard and soft power, we can and should help them put those bulwarks in place. But we can't do that if we don't know where they are, who they are, what they're using, and what they're using it to do. Through the distorting lens of the gaps hypothesis, it can seem like we have a very clear picture of psychedelic use around the world, one that we can reliably use to select and guide our collaborations with Indigenous communities. This is not the case. We have almost everything left to learn. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eli. All right. Now we have Patricia Kubala, who's a PhD candidate in sociocultural anthropology at UC Berkeley. She's a medical anthropologist specializing in the intersections of mental health, social context, and cultural beliefs. Please welcome Patricia. I think I'm getting pretty good at this, you guys.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you to the Center for hosting this wonderful conference. And thank you all for being here. My talk is entitled Testifying in the Name of the Dead, the LSD Visions of Cutsetnik 135633, Yachiel Denur. It is a talk about the Shoah, about the Holocaust. So there's just a content warning. I have minimized any brutal language in the text, but there are some difficult descriptions. So please know that. And Shabbat Shalom to anyone celebrating today or honoring that today. In July 1976, the writer and Auschwitz survivor, Yachiel Feiner, Cutsetnik 135633, Yachiel Denur, 3 names, 1 man, began LSD treatment for concentration camp syndrome at the clinic of Dr. Jan Bastiaan in the Netherlands. 10 years later, after many years of struggling to write about the experience, Feiner Cutsetnik Denur completed an account of the treatment that was published in Hebrew as Sofen, Code, Idma, and an English translation entitled Shiviti, A Vision, appeared in 1989. Feiner was born in 1909 in Sosnowiec, Poland, into a Hasidic community. He attended Orthodox day school and the Sages of Lublin Yeshiva, where he was also a student of Kabbalah. In 1939, Sosnowiec was occupied by the Nazi German forces, and Jewish inhabitants of the town were rounded up, and Feiner was sent to the Kamionka ghetto. After a cache of weapons was found in the ghetto, Feiner was arrested and interrogated by the Gestapo, and one of his interrogators was Adolf Eichmann. In 1943, the ghetto was liquidated, and the inhabitants were deported to Auschwitz. Feiner labored in the camp. He survived the 1945 death march. And after the war, he migrated illegally to Mandate, Palestine, where he lived until his death in 2001. Like many other Jewish immigrants to Israel-Palestine, Feiner changed his name to Denur, meaning from the fire. But for many years, the Israeli public knew of him by the name that appeared on his many books, Cutsetnik 135633. Cutsetnik was Yiddish slang for concentration camper, and the number referred to the concentration camp number that was tattooed in blue on his left arm. Over the course of 2 weeks in 1945, at a British Army hospital in Naples, still wearing the striped uniform he had worn at Auschwitz, he put to paper what was later published as his first book, Salamandra. And many years later, he recalled how the name Cutsetnik, which Denur refused to call a pseudonym or a name de plume, came to be attached to his work. For almost 2.5 weeks, I never once left my desk, he wrote. I gave the manuscript to that soldier ready to carry it for me to Israel. He stood over me, eyeing its title, Salamandra. Then bending closer, he said softly, the author's name. You left it out. I shouted back at him, the name of the author. Those who went to the crematorium wrote this book. Go on, you write their name, Cutsetnik. And this nameless name has appeared ever since on all my books. Cutsetnik, then, is a name for the nameless ones, a nameless name. In an article on Denur's use of Cutsetnik, Jeremy Popkin points out the distinctiveness of this name, Cutsetnik, in contrast to other survivor authors who wrote about their experiences in the camps almost exclusively in the form of first-person memoirs, using their proper names, which many of you I'm sure have heard, Elie Wiesel, Primo Levi, Jean Amery. And Popkin argues that, and I quote, a rigorous separation between Kotsetnik's everyday identity as Denor and that of Kotsetnik 135633 has been central to his attempt to communicate the essence of the Holocaust experience. The use of the number tattooed on his arm at Auschwitz as an authorial name communicates two fundamental facts about his camp experience: that Auschwitz deprived him of the personal identity that would justify a claim to a proper name, and that the purpose of his writings is not to speak of his own experiences, but to record those of the other victims who did not survive to speak for themselves. So he literally understands himself as testifying in the name of the dead. In 1961, Denor Kotsetnik was summoned to testify at the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. By the time of the trial, his books had sold millions of copies and had been translated into several languages. Before the trial, which was televised and broadcast around the world, Denor and Kotsetnik were not publicly known to be the same person. He refused to have his picture on the covers of his books, he refused interviews, and he had kept the two names and identities separate from almost everyone in his life. He had not wanted to testify at the trial. His experience of interrogation at the hands of the Gestapo had rendered him incapable of answering questions. But the court demanded that he appear on the witness stand. Remember, he had actually met Eichmann. So he thought that he would be appearing as Kotsetnik, and that was what he had prepared to do. And he had not wanted to be publicly identified during the trial with Denor. But the court forced an encounter between Denor and Kotsetnik's two identities and names. The footage of Denor's testimony, which ends abruptly with his collapse, became the most famous of the Eichmann trial. On the witness stand, he gave his name as Yachiel Denor. The prosecutor questioning him then asked about Kotsetnik. What was the reason that you hid behind your identity, behind the pseudonym Kotsetnik, Mr. Denor? Denor Kotsetnik speaks slowly, he pauses, he fidgets in his chair. This is very difficult testimony to watch. It is publicly available on YouTube. I won't be showing it. He insists that the name Kotsetnik is not a pen name and that he is not a writer of literary material, but a chronicler of another planet, the planet Auschwitz. He says, time there was not like it is here on Earth, and the inhabitants of this planet, they breathed according to different laws of nature. They did not live, nor did they die, according to the laws of this world. Their name was the number Kotsetnik. Then he pushes up his suit sleeve and glances at his left arm. He continues, if I am able to stand before you today and relate the events within that planet, if I, a fallout of that planet, am able to be here at this time, then I believe with perfect faith that this is due to the oath I swore to them there. The oath I swore to them there. They gave me this strength, for they left me. They always left me. They were parted from me. And this oath always appeared in the look of their eyes. For close on 2 years, they kept on taking leave of me, and they always left me behind. And here he switches tenses. I see them. They're staring at me. I see them. I saw them standing in the queue. And then he rises suddenly from his chair. He's ordered to sit down. He sits down. They try to ask him some questions. Yes, they ask his permission. He tries to respond. And then he suddenly rises and collapses on the witness stand, and the proceedings are adjourned. And this was broadcast around the world. In her book, The Juridical Unconscious, Shoshana Fellman reads Kotsetnik Denor's testimony as pointing to the limits of the law in its encounter with the phenomenon of trauma. The trial reenacts Kotsetnik Denor's trauma, Fellman writes, through its legal repetition of the interrogation he underwent at the hands of Nazi authorities. He is traumatized by the prosecutor's questions and the presiding judge's interruption of his testimony, and in response, he collapses on the witness stand. Before his testimony is interrupted, he tries to convey to the court the impossibility of describing Auschwitz and what he witnessed there. Through the figure of the other planet, he seeks to transmit that Auschwitz is unknowable, ungraspable, unnarratable. An astronomical distance divides it from planet Earth. But the time of Auschwitz is not past. Its influence on planet Earth continues. Thus, as he testifies, his speech oscillates between past and present tense. On the witness stand, he relives the experience of selection, in which those sent to the gas chambers were separated from those chosen to continue laboring in the camp. As Feldman notes, he is not reliving this experience, not just that, but also his connection to the dead, to the nameless ones, Katsetnik, towards whom he swore his oath, and whose name is written on his books because the stories that he writes are in fact theirs. In a way, Feldman writes, he is not alone on the witness stand. He is accompanied by those who left him, but who live within him. But structurally, this places Katsetnik in an impossible situation vis-a-vis the law. On the one hand, he is required to appear in court under his legal name, Yachiel Denor. But on the other hand, he must speak as Katsetnik, a witness for the anonymous and nameless ones that took leave of him at Auschwitz and yet still gaze at him in the present in a traumatic reenactment and repetition of the moment of departure. Feldman thus reads Katsetnik's collapse as indexing a structural impossibility within the trial. He cannot bridge the gap between the two names and the two claims. And likewise, he is caught between the temporality of the law, which requires narration of events in the past tense, and the temporality of his testimony, in which the past is not past and the planet of the ashes, Auschwitz, continues to exert its influence on the present. Feldman calls this temporality that his testimony introduces into the trial a hallucinated timelessness. And she argues that it produces a powerful and necessary disruption of the trial through its implosion of the court's legal norms. And Feldman's interpretation is, some of you are probably aware, a critique of Hannah Arendt's position in Eichmann in Jerusalem, in which Arendt reads Katsetnik's physical and linguistic collapse, his failure to narrate, to testify coherently, as a legal failure. From the perspective of Arendt, the trial, the law more generally, held the promise of a legal remedy for countering the trauma of the Holocaust. In contrast to Arendt, Feldman argues that Katsetnik-Denor's physical and linguistic collapse transmits a very different kind of testimony, one in which the unconscious body, in its muteness, in its incapacity to speak, in fact introduces crucial legal meaning into the trial proceedings. Feldman asserts that far from being a legal failure, Katsetnik's testimony embodies the impossibility of narration that is at the heart of the story of the Shoah and the crimes for which Eichmann is on trial. It is through his disruptive testimony that the trauma of the Holocaust is made present and visible in the courtroom as a ghost inside the House of Justice, she writes. All right, so now for some LSD. The Eichmann trial takes place in 1961, and it's not until 1976 that Denor begins LSD treatment for concentration camp syndrome. In the intervening years, he still refuses to appear publicly or to give interviews. By the time he travels to Leiden in the Netherlands for treatment, it's been 30 years since the Shoah, and for 3 decades, he's been suffering from intense nightmares and other consequences of having the split identity between Denor and Katsetnik. His family is suffering, and after 2 years of pleading by his wife, he agrees to undergo treatment at the clinic of Dr. Jan Bastien here, standing in front of the beautiful villa where the clinic was. And over the course of several months, he stays in Leiden. He actually lives on site at the clinic for a while, and he does 5 LSD sessions. I want to give a shout out. So some of you know this film, The Return from the Other Planet. Highly recommend that you watch it. It's a documentary about Yachiel Denor's life and his LSD treatments, again called The Return from the Other Planet. It's this documentary that was released a couple of years ago, and you'll see why it's called The Return from the Other Planet in a moment. So as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, in 1986, Katsetnik-Denor publishes an account of the treatments entitled Sofen Code, Idma in Hebrew, which is later translated into English as Shaviti, a Vision. Shaviti is an extraordinary account of psychedelic therapy. The narrative weaves together his harrowing memories of Auschwitz with Kabbalah-inspired mystical themes and apocalyptic visions of nuclear holocaust, alongside accounts of prisoners' brave acts of faith and humanity. It's very much a Jewish, Hasidic, and Kabbalistic text. Each section of the book is introduced by a scriptural epigraph from the books of the prophets, specifically from Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Jonah, and Zechariah. This is the example from the third session. And in the memoir, he calls each session a gate. I can also talk about why the lion is fragmented in the Q&A. There are numerous instances of synesthesia in the text, including the repetition of "I see the voice," which recalls Exodus 20:18 and the synesthetic experience of the Jewish community as it is gathered at Mount Sinai to receive the law in the form of the Ten Commandments. There's also a lot to say about the Hebrew title, which is Solfen Code Idma. For the sake of time, I'm not going to speak to it now. I'm happy to discuss it during the Q&A and just say that Idma is a reference to a segula, a magical ritual incantation, which throughout Shaviti, he says, allowed him to survive. So the title of the English version, Shaviti, refers to a prayer aid, sometimes hung in front of synagogues or used for private contemplation, that contains the phrase, "I have set the Lord always before me," from Psalm 16, verse 8. While the words cure and healing are never used in his account of the treatments, Danur Katsetnik undergoes a profound transformation. After the sessions, his nightmares end, and he begins to make public appearances. And another important sign of this transformation is that unlike his other books, Shaviti is written in the first person. What the representatives of the law at the Eichmann trial cannot hear and understand becomes possible to work through via Katsetnik, Danur's visions in the LSD sessions, and the transferential relationship with Dr. Bastien that develops over the course of his time in the clinic. So Bastien's approach to LSD therapy is a psychoanalytic one. It encourages patients to relive traumatic experiences in order to process and release the suppressed memories and emotions associated with them, a therapeutic process known as abreaction. And Katsetnik reiterates throughout Shaviti that under the LSD, he was returned to Auschwitz and that in Leiden, he could see things that he could not see before. So whereas the hallucinated timelessness of the law and his nightmares engender a traumatic repetition, the hallucinated timelessness of the LSD sessions allow him to bridge the traumatic abyss between temporalities, planets, and names in ways not possible at the Eichmann trial. In Leiden, under the influence of the LSD, there's an interruption of the traumatic repetition. So I mentioned a moment ago that after the publication of Shaviti, Katsetnik, successful author, had shunned public life. But after the publication, he begins to speak about the book's message. He appears in 1988 on a popular TV program in Israel, Now is the Time. And he says that the reason for appearing in public has to do with his LSD vision of an SS man overseeing an early morning transport of prisoners to the crematorium. The morning is cold, and the SS man buries his hands in his coat pockets as he yawns sleepily. So he's overseeing, again, the transport of prisoners to the crematorium. Under the influence of the LSD, a terrible thought seizes hold of Katsetnik. The SS man could have been in his place, Katsetnik writes. Well, I could have been standing there instead of him on just such a cold morning, doing my job, delivering him and millions like him to the crematorium. And like him, I too would yawn, because like him, I'd certainly prefer snuggling under the covers of my warm bed on such a cold morning like this. So the vision continues to unfold, and here is what he describes seeing. I saw the Shaviti, and I saw God in a cloud, God's spirit hovering in the letters of his name. His glory filled the horizon from the Auschwitz earth to the Auschwitz skies, and the face of the SS man and his yawn and the vortex of the letters Adonai. There was a tangle of snakes squirming at the center of the Shaviti, and I was anxious to see the face of Satan, creator of Auschwitz, but instead I suddenly saw my own face imposed over the frenzied snakes. On my head, an SS cap, the death skull emblem above the visor, and through the empty eye sockets of that death skull, I watched the truck driving toward the crematorium, and I yawned and kept looking at that SS man, now just one more naked skeleton, amid a mass of naked skeletons being hauled off to the burning. So this moment of vision, this visionary moment of empathy and this for the SS man provokes in Katsetnik an agonizing theological question. Oh Lord, merciful and compassionate Lord, am I the one who's created Auschwitz? It's much worse than that he, the German facing me with the death skull insignia, could have been in my place. It's that I, and this is the paralyzing horror, I could have been there in his place. So this vision of himself as the SS man repeats across multiple sessions alongside apocalyptic visions of nuclear holocaust, in which he and millions of others are consumed by fire, which is a reference, of course, to the literal meaning of the Holocaust in Greek. And then at other times in the sessions, Katsetnik sees horrific visions of himself as the agent of apocalypse nucleus. So these radical self-shattering LSD visions, moving into my conclusion, in which he himself is the SS man, he himself is nucleus, they rupture and remake his understanding of the camps and the nature of evil. No longer does he think of Auschwitz as another planet, but a possible choice that inheres in the heart of the human and that defines the post-World War II era. He writes in the final section of Shaviti that he leaves Leiden with a new vow. From now on, survival duty was to be the bearer of testimony in the trial of God versus Satan, the trial that is being conducted in the heart of man. So on this program, the Ram Evron asks him, how could you say such a thing with the Germans? The SS and I are one. How can you say that as an Auschwitz survivor? And he says, Katsetnik says, yes, that is essentially the book. Auschwitz is not the other planet, as I previously thought. Once you say it was the other planet, once you say it was Satan or God, that is escape. That means you've learned nothing. I, a human being, people created Auschwitz. The finger that would push the button that could turn this world into chaos, tohu vavohu, is a person's finger. And that's what happened at Auschwitz. This is the cry of the book, See and Choose Life, which is a reference to Deuteronomy chapter 30. And finishing up here. Just want to say that in thinking about Katsetnik's experiences on LSD, I find it useful to invoke Gershom Scholem's distinction between prophecy and mystical experience in his classic essay, Religious Authority and Mysticism. So in this essay, Scholem describes the experience of the mystic as being indefinable and communicable. In contrast, the prophet hears a clear message and sometimes beholds an equally plain vision, which he also remembers clearly. So reading Katsetnik and his LSD visions as on the order of the prophetic rather than the mystical makes visible that the LSD treatments restore for him the capacity to transmit something other than a traumatic repetition. There's a new kind of testimony that is made possible by the treatments. There's a clear message and an imperative for Katsetnik to speak it. Shaviti is written as an address to a community in a theological language that bears witness to the suffering and survival and endurance of that community. And it is also a warning. Wherever there is humankind, there is Auschwitz. It wasn't Satan who created the nucleus, but you and I. And in the paraphrased words of Deuteronomy 30, see and choose life. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Okay, next we have Kayla Bleja. Okay, nice. Kayla Bleja, who's an eco-theology scholar at the Laudato Si Research Institute at Campion Hall at the University of Oxford, where she's also a PhD student. And her research brings theology into dialogue with biomimicry to examine how natural processes inform theological understanding. Please welcome Kayla.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you to the three presenters before me who has given us a lot to think about and also laid some useful groundwork for my talk. So as psilocybin-assisted therapy moves towards mainstream clinical use, there's potential for many people to benefit from such interventions. And a portion of these patients who could benefit from them will also come from communities who are actively resistant. Religious affiliation is one of the strongest predictors of that resistance. And there are Christian patients and clinicians who will have to grapple with a set of theological questions that the Christian tradition has not yet adequately addressed. Up to this point, there has been no systematic account of the full range of theological objections that recur in Christian discourse on psychedelics. And this gap is significant because you can't engage an objection seriously or find common ground with communities that hold it until you know what it is. So this paper contributes to that conversation by asking two related questions: whether psilocybin mushrooms can be understood as compatible with divine purposes for human flourishing, and whether Christians in principle can endorse their therapeutic use. I want to be upfront about what this paper doesn't do, which is try to settle whether psilocybin-induced experiences are genuinely spiritual in origin. That question remains open. But what it does ask is how Christian theology might discern and respond to such experiences, given their documented psychological character. So the analysis is structured. Oh, yeah, this is the clinical background. It's this section. Is structured around 7 theological objections that recur in Christian reflection on psilocybin, which I have mapped out from a close reading of historical Christian sources, contemporary scholarship, and current online discourse. And I will be covering a lot of ground quickly today and offering really compressed versions of these objections that could probably each sustain papers of their own. But ultimately, my argument is that each objection raises a genuine concern, but none of them, taken on their own, establish that psilocybin-assisted therapy is intrinsically incompatible with Christian commitments. So you are likely to be familiar with the therapeutic literature, so I'll be brief on the clinical picture. But what matters for the theological argument is this: psilocybin-assisted therapy is not casual drug use. It follows a structured 3-phase model with preparation, the actual medicine session, and then post-session integration, embedded in a supervised clinical relationship. And the patients in these studies are often people with chronic treatment-resistant conditions for whom conventional options have largely failed. 2 features of the mechanism will resurface throughout the objections. First, psilocybin works by temporarily destabilizing rigid neural pathways, but it doesn't replace psychological work. It makes that work more accessible. Second, the experience is heavily shaped by set and setting, by a patient's intentions, preparation, and relational context of care. And both of these matter a great deal for how we should evaluate what follows. So I'm going to introduce the 7 objections. The first of which is substance, self-control, and moral agency. So this objection is that psilocybin impairs judgment and self-control. And since Christian moral theology places significant weight on self-control as a virtue, as a fruit of the Spirit, any practice that reliably compromises it is likely to be suspect from the start. The objection identifies the importance of moral agency, and a Christian ethic of substance use has to take that seriously. But notice what the objection actually requires to work. It needs the claim that any temporary impairment of cognitive control is morally disqualifying, and that claim is far too strong. Christian moral theology does not hold that position. Most Christians accept a range of clinical interventions, anesthesia, sedation, certain medications, in which a person temporarily surrenders ordinary cognitive control. And they don't regard those as morally problematic because they evaluate them by a different standard, not what happens to your consciousness during the procedure, but whether you consented beforehand, whether the purpose is healing, whether your capacity for moral life is restored afterward. So intent, content, and outcome are what matter, not the altered state itself. Psilocybin-assisted therapy fits squarely within that framework. Patients are screened, they give informed consent, and experience is embedded within preparation and integration. The temporary alteration of consciousness is a moment within the structured therapeutic process aimed at restoring the very capacities the objection is concerned to protect. So the objection taken seriously doesn't rule out psilocybin-assisted therapy. On the contrary, I think it gives us the right criteria for evaluating it. Objection 2, spiritual dangers, is one that I find most theologically interesting and probably the hardest to resolve cleanly. It argues that psilocybin introduces experiences that may exert a formative influence on one's beliefs, on spiritual self-understanding, on how people interpret meaning and transcendence. And that it does so in ways that can bypass or undermine the ordinary Christian means of discernment. The concern is that something is shaping a person's deepest convictions while their usual safeguards are temporarily offline. And studies confirm that psilocybin can alter metaphysical and religious beliefs, and sometimes durably, sometimes increasing openness towards perhaps non-theistic frameworks. So from a pastoral perspective, this raises concerns about the possibility of spiritual confusion, doctrinal destabilization, particularly where experiences are interpreted in isolation from ecclesial guidance. A common response is to insist that psilocybin-induced experiences are merely psychological, neurobiological, and therefore they lack spiritual significance. But neurobiological mediation doesn't settle questions of spiritual meaning. There are many Christian practices like fasting, prayer, or meditation that involve identifiable physiological mechanisms. But in these cases, the presence of such a mechanism doesn't determine the significance of what moves through it. So here's what that means. We can't dismiss the experience, and we also can't simply accept them at face value. I think the question here is epistemic, not what these experiences fundamentally are, but how they should be evaluated. And on that point, Christian tradition is actually quite clear. Spiritual experiences require testing against scripture, against doctrine, against communal wisdom, or the fruits that they produce over time. They're not self-authenticating. So one could argue that this standard holds even if the experience was pharmacologically induced. An appropriate theological response to this objection, I think, is conditional, where psilocybin-assisted therapy is accompanied by genuine integration within a Christian community, where someone has the theological resources, the relational support to interpret and to test what happened. The risks of spiritual confusion can be mitigated. Where those structures are absent, then the objection perhaps retains its full force. So the question here then is whether the conditions for responsible engagement exist in this context. The third objection is demonic influence. And this is one that academic theologians are sometimes tempted to move past quickly, but I want to resist that temptation because I think doing so would misrepresent both the seriousness of the concern and the tradition from which it comes. The objection is that psilocybin-induced altered states may render individuals spiritually vulnerable not just to confusion or misinterpretation, but to malevolent spiritual agency. So here, proponents draw on a long line tradition, Christian caution about practices that deliberately dismantle one's ordinary psychological defenses, particularly where those practices have historical associations with shamanic rituals or occultic practice or the invocation of like non-Christian spiritual forces. And this concern sits within a mainstream Christian theology of spiritual warfare, often that takes seriously the possibility that not every non-ordinary experience originates from a benign source. The reflex response that psilocybin's effects are neurobiologically mediated doesn't work here for a reason I've already flagged. Physiological mechanisms and spiritual significance are not mutually exclusive categories in Christian theology. The tradition doesn't require the absence of natural causation as a condition for spiritual reality. So the demonic influence objection can't be neutralized simply by pointing to like serotonin receptors. What can be said, however, is this. Christian theology evaluates spiritual risk in relation to context, intention, and the presence of safeguards, not pharmacology alone. So concerns about malevolent influence don't arise uniformly across all non-ordinary experiences. They arise where discernment is absent, where accountability structures are missing, or where a person is spiritually isolated and without pastoral care. I argue that those are the conditions that the Christian tradition identifies as dangerous, not the altered state itself. This means that the objection is most powerful not as a categorical prohibition, but as a demand that any engagement with psilocybin-assisted therapy be accompanied by serious theological literacy, pastoral oversight, and ongoing community support. Where those are present, the Christian tradition's own logic suggests that the risks are not categorically different from those attending other spiritually intense experiences, like having visions, mystical states, near-death experiences, which Christian theology has long sought to discern rather than simply forbid. And structures like guided preparation, ongoing integration, and accountability will mitigate these risks. So the next objection cuts deeper than it might initially appear. The claim isn't that psilocybin is ineffective or that its benefits don't last, but that even if it works, even if the transformation is real and durable, there is something morally and spiritual suspect about how it was achieved. The worry is that psilocybin offers access to states of emotional breakthrough, self-transcendence, or profound insight that the Christian tradition associates with sustained practices of discipline or suffering or communal formation. And that obtaining those states pharmacologically may circumvent the processes through which character or change is formed. On this view, the problem isn't the destination, but it's that you didn't make the journey. In other words, the fourth objection is that psilocybin is an illegitimate shortcut one might use to bypass a more difficult, time-consuming process of transformation. My response has two parts. The first is empirical. The research actually supports the objection in one important respect. Without adequate preparation and integration, the long-term impact of psilocybin-assisted therapy is limited. The medicine session alone does not produce durable change. What produces the change is the medicine session with the structured therapeutic process and the time invested in preparation and the sustained post-session integration. So this means that psilocybin is not in practice eliminating the need for effort or engagement, but it is changing the conditions under which that effort becomes possible. The second part is theological. The shortcut objection assumes that the formative value of an experience is inversely proportional to how it was accessed. That ease of access diminishes authenticity. But that assumption is difficult to sustain within Christian moral theology. What the tradition actually evaluates is not the difficulty of the path, but the integrity of the transformation, whether it produces a genuine change in the person's agency or their relationships or their orientation towards God and neighbor. A person who undergoes psilocybin-assisted therapy and emerges more capable of love, more honest about their failures, more open to community. Does the Christian tradition have grounds to call that transformation inauthentic simply because it emerged through a session rather than through years of struggle? There is a version of the objection that remains, but as a categorical prohibition on psilocybin, the shortcut objection, I think, does not hold because used responsibly within this deliberate framework. Psilocybin is less a bypass and more like a door, and it requires that you still walk through it. Objection 5 extends from the fourth and is probably the most philosophically ambitious of the 7, and in some ways the most important because it doesn't just challenge psilocybin, it challenges the entire framework within which therapeutic interventions are typically justified. The argument runs like this. Within Aristotelian and Thomistic moral theology, human flourishing is a life ordered towards virtue, and in Christian theology, ultimately, towards love of God and neighbor. On that account, what matters morally is not just whether a person feels better, but whether their life is becoming more fully human in this deepest sense. This objection is that certain forms of psychological struggle are integral to that process, and if pharmacological intervention removes or shortens those struggles, it may also foreclose the very conditions under which the virtues that constitute flourishing are cultivated. The worry, in other words, is that it may help them in ways that leave them less fully formed. The objection contains an assumption that psychological suffering is reliably formative, and this assumption is harder to sustain than it first appears. Both Aristotle and Aquinas recognized that adversity contributes to virtue only under certain conditions that include the capacity for rational agency, for relational support, and for the freedom to respond. And when suffering becomes so severe that it destroys those conditions, it is no longer functioning as a crucible for virtue. It becomes an obstacle to the life it was supposed to form. In those cases, healing is not an evasion of human telos, but it is what makes the pursuit of telos possible again. What the telos objection does at its best is reframe the ethical question in a way that I think is genuinely clarifying. It shifts us away from asking simply whether psilocybin alleviates suffering towards asking whether it supports or undermines the conditions required for a life ordered towards virtue or towards love. I think that is the right question, where psilocybin functions to restore those conditions in people for whom suffering has become an obstacle rather than a crucible. The objection's force is substantially reduced. And where it is used in ways that substitute pharmacological relief for the harder work of moral and spiritual formation, then I think the concern stands. The sixth objection is the one with the most traction in popular Christian discourse. It points to biblical condemnations of sorcery, witchcraft, and idolatrous practices, often associated with the Greek term pharmakeia. So in Galatians 5 and Relations 9 and 18, pharmakeia is listed alongside idolatry, immorality, and demonic influence. And some critics conclude that because scripture condemns pharmakeia, it must also condemn psychedelic substances. The Greek root pharmakon, though, is polyvalent. It can mean remedy, poison, or ritual substance, and which meaning applies is determined by the practices, intentions, and symbolic frameworks that surround its use. So in the Greco-Roman world, pharmakeia referred to a specific kind of ritualized practices, substances used in combination with incantations or deliberate attempts to manipulate like spiritual cosmic forces. And what made that sinful in biblical authors' view was not that it involved a substance, but that it was a particular kind of reach for power, an attempt to circumvent God by accessing other spiritual forces. And this is like consistently biblically associated with idolatry. So that's the practice that is being condemned. Psilocybin-assisted therapy does not involve any of that architecture. It has an empirical framework that's based on informed consent, a therapeutic relationship, and to apply the biblical prohibition of pharmakeia to that is to collapse two categorically distinct practices into this undifferentiated prohibition on the basis of just the presence of a substance. So the biblical tradition here also contains a broader current of caution that is found particularly in patristic and mystical writers against the deliberate pursuit of extraordinary experiences, especially where that pursuit reflects a desire for spiritual power or revelatory insight or access to transcendent states outside the ordinary means of grace. But this doesn't directly map onto pharmakeia. And if psilocybin is used as a means of revelation or spiritual transcendence, the conclusion that I draw here is that the biblical prohibition of pharmakeia does not straightforwardly condemn this kind of therapy, but the tradition's deeper suspicion of the human desire to grasp at transcendence through these means, I think, remains a legitimate caution. And lastly, the seventh objection is less about what psilocybin does and more about what it represents. And the Christian concern is that Christians are called to be not of this world, and that the current enthusiasm for psilocybin feels continuous with a broader secular logic of perhaps optimization or finding the fastest route to the best outcome, or the worry is that like you're substituting a culturally fashionable solution for a Christian means of formation, perhaps through prayer or repentance or humility or just dependence on God. At the same time, the inference from worldly origin to morally impermissible is not one that Christian ethics can sustain consistently, because Christians use medicine, they use surgery, they use chemotherapy, other interventions that may have been developed within secular scientific frameworks, often by people with no theological commitments whatsoever, and they do not regard that as unfaithfulness. The tradition has generally understood the use of medicine not as a displacement of divine provision, but as one of the ways that God's care for embodied finite creatures could be mediated through human knowledge and skill. So there's no principled reason for why psilocybin should be excluded from that framework simply because it is new or controversial or associated in cultural imagination with a specific counterculture. So here I think the objection is not that psilocybin comes from secular science, but that it could be embraced within a secular frame, such that it forms people in the direction of a particular account of the self that could be at odds with Christian anthropology. The response then is not to refuse engagement, I think, but to work on the terms of engagement. And Christian involvement with psilocybin-assisted therapy, I think, could be characterized here by a theological framework oriented towards deeper ends of human life as Christianity understands them. So I think this objection does not demonstrate that the clinical use of psilocybin is inherently worldly or incompatible with Christian faith, but rather points at how one frames and integrates it and how that matters enormously. So having briefly passed through all these objections, where does that leave us? None of these objections individually establish that psilocybin-assisted therapy is intrinsically incompatible with these Christian commitments to healing and to care for the suffering. I think the question is under what conditions engagement might be most theologically responsible. And I also think that Christian communities can offer something that perhaps clinical settings typically cannot, which is long-term social integration, accountability, and shared practices of meaning making. And for patients dealing with chronic illness, trauma, or end-of-life distress, that kind of sustained community support could be a really important resource available to them, and one that some clinical frameworks would lack the structure to provide. So I think the question is not whether Christian theology has a role to play in the future of psilocybin-assisted therapy. I think it plainly does. The question is whether the field will make room for that Christian contribution, and whether the Christian communities themselves will have the seriousness and the humility to consider offering it well. And that seems to me like a conversation worth having, and I hope that this paper is a contribution towards it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kayla. So thank you for reminding us that we are, in fact, at a divinity school. It was initially intended to do theological, spiritual formation for ministers. Sometimes you forget, you see so many things through the day. All right, I have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I have 9 questions. I'm curious, one of the 9 is if any of you have any questions for one another. You saw something in your own work, your own research about healing across Lesotho, psychedelic therapists in Australia, the reckoning with the trauma of the Shoah, or what a sort of theological integration of psychedelics into Christianity. Through each of these prisms, do you see anything? Do you have questions for one another? Oh, you have to just.
Alex and Kayla, thank you. You both mentioned discernment, and I would love to hear perhaps if there might be some kind of dialogue around discernment that what the kind of practice or work of learning that discernment might be for the practitioners, as well as within the frameworks, cosmologies, communities that you also were speaking about.
Oh, you don't have a microphone.
I think you might have just turned.
Discernment. Yeah. I mean, as an anthropologist sitting up here talking about psychedelic therapy, I have the task of trying to kind of represent a group of professionals and practitioners and people. And when I think about, okay, what does discernment look like when you're in an altered state caused by caring for someone on psilocybin? What unique challenges of discernment emerge therein? One thing that comes to mind is, it's quite a bit published on the importance of therapists having their own self-experiences with psychedelics in order to kind of equip them with certain skills. And now we're starting to see some like clinical research on that. And there was a study that came out of the Monash psychedelic lab where they were allowed to dose therapists. Like the therapists didn't have to go and do it secretly. And therapists realized, one of the insights was that when they take the drug themselves, they realize, gosh, just how sensitive these drugs can make you. And that changed the way they cared for their participants, because they realized that, coming in with a very strong psychotherapeutic impulse could actually backfire when you're on a high dose of psilocybin. So that kind of comes to mind, the question of having your own path therapists will talk about with psychedelics. But then you also have, because there's a bit of a gold rush into clinical psychedelic therapy, you also have therapists who, or scientists who get a grant and then they read, oh gosh, I have to have the drug experience myself. And they go somewhere to do it to kind of just tick the box. So I've heard that from underground therapists who are dosing above ground therapists, that Some of them are kind of more on a spiritual path, they describe it, and other ones are a bit more bureaucratic in their motivations. So yeah, there's a whole kind of question there around, you know, how important is your own spiritual practice to therapeutic discernment in psychedelic therapy? And I don't think there's a clear answer yet.
I will say that the conversation in Christianity about discernment is very complicated, especially across different traditions. And there are some well-developed resources for that, probably the most sophisticated of which is the Ignatius like discernment of spirits. I think for me, what is central is that a person does not interpret their experiences alone. So I think discernment is about relationship. I think it is not a gatekeeping function where someone else is deciding what is allowed or what is real, but it's closer to accompaniment, which is understanding that you are accountable to something larger than yourself, but also that which is larger than you is also accountable to you. So I think that's a really important thing to consider when having that conversation about discernment.
On that question of discernment, specifically with reference to your talk, Kayla, you surfaced a question at the end of under what conditions might sort of Christian use of psychedelics occur. I'm curious if you have any ideas about what those conditions might be. Is it incorporating a Christian chaplain into a otherwise secular sort of healing landscape or something else entirely? Are we having psilocybin Bible studies?
Well, there's a lot of Christian therapists out there. There's a lot of people who get really serious psychological training who are Christian. And I'm sure there's lots of Christian therapists who are excited about what psilocybin could do for the people they're trying to help. So I would imagine that there's lots of people who want to take this seriously in the same way that, like, you know, a secular therapist would. And they could create centers where people come in and experience the same sort of thing, but under the more, you know, familiar Christian tradition and theology, and allow them to experience the same sort of thing, but be able to talk about it, perhaps with their pastor in the room or with someone who understands their own particular tradition and the language and the library of knowledge that Christians share that perhaps a secular therapist would not. But I think there's a huge opportunity there for these spaces to be created so that religious people can help each other and also access the same sort of thing in a way that makes them feel safe.
cswr.hds.harvard.edu. Copyright 2026. The President and Fellows of Harvard College.